The first reports reached Earth as fragments rather than a clear message, broken telemetry, and panicked civilian broadcasts leaking out of the Talarin Reach, a quiet stretch of space where humanity had never planted flags or built colonies, a region that mattered to no major power except for one old promise that most of the galaxy had forgotten, because decades earlier, when the crystalline-bodied Talarin Concordat had been hunted to the brink of extinction by raiders, it was human ships that had arrived, outdated by galactic standards and flying under no alliance banner, answering a call that no one else bothered to acknowledge, and an ambassador named Elias Moreno had stood before a bored galactic council and said plainly that allies were not disposable, a statement that earned polite nods and private ridicule. But the Talarin remembered it, so when the Virex Dominion attacked without warning, orbital lances carving through living cities grown from coral spires, moons shattered to prevent evacuation, trade stations turned into burning debris fields. The Talarin did not appeal to the council that had ignored them before. They sent their call straight toward Earth, and for 6 hours it seemed like no one answered, not because humanity hesitated, but because the signal crawled through diplomatic channels the galaxy assumed humans still depended on. Outdated routes no one bothered to modernize, because no one thought humans mattered enough to threaten anyone. And when the message finally reached the United Earth Security Assembly, the room went silent as the footage played, showing Talarin civilians driven into containment pits by Virex shock troops, their translators broadcasting pleas that cut through every layer of protocol, and Ambassador Lena Raman did not shout or argue. She simply stated that the Mutual Defense Compact had been invoked, a sentence that activated systems older than many empires now sitting comfortably on the Council, because humanity did not sign agreements casually, and they did not forget them either. While across the Dominion frontier the Virex celebrated, their warlords broadcasting victories and mocking the idea that the Talarin had allies worth fearing, their analysts confidently describing humans as a peaceful regional species, industrially capable but culturally weak, bound by ethics, internal debate, and the need for consensus, too slow to respond decisively, and when Virex scouts detected unusual movement in human space, shipyards flaring to life, freight corridors reversing flow, they labeled it panic and economic disruption rather than mobilization, because Dominion doctrine insisted humans required months to prepare for war, time to argue among themselves, time to fracture politically, and what the Dominion failed to understand was that humanity had long ago learned how to separate argument from action, how to let civilian voices rage while military systems moved in silence, so while public networks debated morality and legality, something much older and quiet awoke beneath Earth's oceans and deep within hollowed asteroids. Fleets that officially did not exist receiving orders that contained no speeches or threats, only coordinates and execution windows. And deep under the Pacific arcology, Admiral Thomas Reed read the casualty projections from the Talarin Reach and felt a familiar weight settle into his chest. Not anger, but responsibility, because he had been a junior officer when humans first promised the Talarin protection, and to him promises were not abstract ideals. They were debts that accrued interest. The Virex Dominion first sensed that something was wrong when their forward-listening arrays went blind, not destroyed, just silent, their data feeds replaced by perfect static that diagnostic teams could not penetrate. Then long-range sensors began reporting distortions in space that did not match any known drive signatures, shadows where no mass should be, and still their commanders dismissed the warnings as sensor ghosts or experimental stealth tests, until a human ship appeared inside a fortified system without triggering a single alarm, not arriving with a flash or shockwave, but simply existing where empty space had been moments earlier, its matte black hull composed of angles that refused to settle in the eye, and the Virex station commander demanded identification and compliance, scoffing when the only response was a calm transmission in clear trade dialect stating that humanity was present to extract its allies and that resistance would be met proportionally, the word proportionally drawing laughter from command deck moments before the station's primary cannon fired a beam capable of cracking continents and struck nothing at all, because the human vessel was no longer where it had been, and before the Virex could adjust targeting. The station lost power not through damage but absence, its reactors removed from reality itself, folded into containment lattices and vented into null space, a technology humanity had developed while trying to solve its own energy crises and never bothered to advertise, and across the Dominion border similar scenes unfolded as human vessels slipped past offenses, disabling fleets without spectacle, boarding ships to evacuate prisoners, leaving Virex warcraft drifting and powerless. their command structures collapsing under electronic warfare so subtle it felt like betrayal by their own machines, forcing the Galactic Council into emergent secession as reports contradicted centuries of assumptions, because humans were not fighting like an enraged species lashing out. They were fighting like custodians restoring order, and that unsettled even the oldest powers, as Ambassador Raman calmly informed the Council that humanity sought no territory, tribute, or submission. That operations would cease once the Talarin was secure and the Dominion's capacity to repeat the offense was removed, a phrasing that chilled the chamber because capacity was not a political demand but an engineering one, and on the ground in the shattered Talarin capital, Virex troops felt the shift before they understood it, gravity fluctuating just enough to disrupt formation, the air humming with unfamiliar pressure. Then human soldiers appeared, unmarked armor, efficient movements, speaking softly to terrified civilians while disabling enemies with precise force, Sergeant Maya Chen lifting a Talarin child from the rubble and telling them they were safe now, and meaning it, because above them the sky was filled with human ships forming an interlocking lattice no Virex weapon could breach, and as Dominion High Command finally grasped the scale of their mistake, projections showing that even total mobilization would not close the gap because humanity had not deployed its full strength, only what was required. Restraint revealed as choice rather than limitation, the war that would decide the Dominion's fate had already passed the point where survival was possible. The Virex Dominion did not collapse all at once, because empires never do. They fracture first in the mind before they fail in reality, and as human operations expanded beyond the Talarin reach, confusion spread faster than fear, commanders issuing orders that never arrived, admirals watching fleet icons freeze on tactical displays, governors realizing their planetary defense grid were answering queries that had not been sent, because humanity's second phase was not built around destruction, but isolation, the systematic severing of the Dominion's ability to function as a coherent whole, and from the outside it looked almost merciful. No cities burning, no stars going nova, just silence where authority used to be, while inside the Dominion panic metastasized as species that had relied on Virex protection began fleeing or hiding, convinced the humans would treat them as collaborators. A fear that proved misplaced when the first humanitarian corridors opened, escorted by human vessels broadcasting simple messages offering evacuation and medical aid to non-combatants, messages that confused Dominion propaganda so badly that some systems fired on their own rescue ships out of reflex, only to discover their weapons disabled mid-cycle, not jammed but politely shut down, as if corrected by an unseen hand. And at the heart of this quiet unraveling, the Dominion high strategist, Virex Val, finally understood the core error, not that the Virex had underestimated human firepower, but that they had misunderstood human motivation entirely, because the models assumed retaliation driven by pride or vengeance, predictable emotional spikes followed by escalation. But what they faced instead was a culture that treated protection as obligation, not passion, and obligation was relentless, methodical, and horrifyingly patient. As human task groups advanced along vectors that mirrored old Dominion supply routes, cutting them not by force but by removing key logistical nodes from existence, stations emptied, fuel depots rendered inert, data archives copied and then erased, leaving Virex fleets with ships intact but nowhere to go and no one to tell them what to do. And when the high strategist ordered all remaining fleets to converge for a decisive engagement, the command returned with confirmation, and then nothing happened, because the fleets could not move, their navigation systems quietly rewritten to prevent collisions that human algorithms predicted would occur if they attempted mass maneuvering, a safeguard that Virex engineers could not override without crashing their own ships, and across the Dominion world citizens watched as their leaders lost control without a single human shot fired, while on Earth the public finally learned the scale of what was happening. News feeds filled with footage of rescued Talarin families arriving at human safe zones, bewildered commentators arguing whether the response was excessive or overdue, protests flaring in some cities even as enlistment centers quietly filled, because humanity had always been like this, loud in disagreement, unified in action, and Admiral Reed watched the feeds without comment. Focus instead on reports from embedded diplomats moving alongside the fleets, because the third phase required something harder than warfare. It required ending the war without creating something worse. And that meant confronting the Dominion's ruling caste directly, not as conquerors but as judges. So when a secure channel opened to Virex Val, the high strategist expected threats or demands, and instead received a simple request for a meeting, location neutral, observers welcome, Conditions limited to the immediate cessation of hostilities against the Talarin and the surrender of all Dominion strategic command codes, a demand so precise it left no room for negotiation theater. And when Kethrix tried to stall, citing council arbitration and legal precedent, the human envoy, a civilian named Daniel Ortiz with no visible rank, calmly explained that arbitration assumed parity and that parity no longer existed, not because humans desired dominance, but because the Dominion had forfeited trust, and trust once broken could not be restored through paperwork, only through consequences, a concept that struck deeper than any threat, because it framed the war not as a clash of powers but as a moral accounting. And as days passed and the Dominion's infrastructure continued to unravel, regional governors began defecting, not to humanity but to neutrality, shutting down military production and opening their systems to inspection teams in hopes of being spared further disruption, a hope humanity honored consistently, reinforcing the terrifying realization that humans were keeping track of everything, rewarding compliance, ignoring bluster, and never acting emotionally. And on the ruined Talarin homeworld, reconstruction began even before the last Virex troops were extracted. Human engineers working alongside Talarin architects to stabilize ecosystems and rebuild cities not as replicas of the old, but as stronger versions designed to survive future threats. Sergeant Maya Chen returning to the same square weeks later to find the child she had rescued helping distribute food, their translator chirping with excitement as they asked if the humans were staying forever, a question Maya did not answer directly, because humanity had never wanted to rule anyone, only to make sure that when they left, no one else could hurt their friends again. And in the shadows of the galaxy, older powers watched with growing unease, realizing that the humans were not claiming territory or tribute. They were reshaping norms, proving that intervention did not require conquest and that restraint could coexist with overwhelming force, a lesson far more destabilizing than invasion, because it meant the old excuses no longer worked. And as Kethrix Val finally agreed to the meeting, his confidence shattered. The Dominion's fate was already sealed, not by human weapons but by the realization that the war had never been about survival for humanity, only for the Virex, and humanity had planned accordingly. The meeting took place in a volume of space no chart bothered to name, a neutral gravity well stabilized by human engineering that felt unnervingly natural, as if the universe itself had agreed to host a conversation, and Kethrix Val arrived surrounded by what remained of his honor guard, their weapons inert by mutual agreement, though everyone present understood that only one side could violate that agreement and survive, while Daniel Ortiz waited alone at the center, no armor, no visible augmentation, just a man with tired eyes and a tablet containing data that represented the slow death of an empire. And when Kethrix demanded to know why humanity had gone to such lengths for a minor ally, Ortiz answered without hesitation that scale had never been the point, that humans did not measure worth in population or economic output, but in commitments made and kept, a concept that Kethrix struggled to process because the Dominion worldview treated alliances as leverage rather than bonds. And as the discussion unfolded, it became clear that humanity had already mapped every possible outcome, each branch leading to the same end unless the Dominion complied fully, surrendering not only command authority but the institutional mechanisms that allowed unilateral aggression, including the dismantling of the war cast itself, a demand that provoked outrage from the Virex delegation until Ortiz calmly displayed projections showing how those mechanisms would otherwise be removed. Externally, system by system, with consequences far more chaotic, and faced with a choice between controlled disassembly and uncontrolled collapse, Kethrix Val hesitated for the first time in his career, because the humans were offering something no victor in Virex history ever had, a way to lose without extinction. While beyond the meeting space, the galaxy adjusted in real time as council members scrambled to rewrite doctrines that suddenly felt obsolete, emergency coalitions forming not against humanity but around them, seeking reassurance that similar interventions would not occur arbitrarily, reassurance Ambassador Raman provided by reiterating a principle so simple it unsettled everyone who heard it, that humanity did not intervene because it could, but because it had to, and that difference mattered. On the Talarin homeworld, reconstruction accelerated as ecosystems stabilized under human-designed climate lattices, refugees returning to cities that bore scars but also promise. And when the first joint memorial was held for the dead, human and Talarin names engraved side by side, broadcasts of the ceremony spread farther than any battle footage, reshaping public opinion across dozens of species who had only ever known power expressed through domination. And inside the Dominion, the surrender rippled outward as regional commanders laid down arms not in despair but relief, realizing that survival no longer required obedience to a system that had never protected them. While Kethric's Val signed the final accord with a trembling appendage, fully aware that he would be remembered as a leader who lost a war but spared his people annihilation, a legacy that fell hollow until Ortiz told him quietly that it was more than most conquerors ever managed, and as human fleets began their gradual withdrawal, leaving behind monitoring arrays and advisory teams rather than garrisons, the galaxy took its first uncertain steps into a new balance of power where fear was no longer the only deterrent, and Admiral Reed, reviewing final reports as ships powered down and crews rotated home, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, knowing that the war the Dominion could not survive had ended not with a final shot, but with a lesson written across the stars, that attacking a human ally was not an act against the weak, but a challenge to a species that treated loyalty as law and had built its entire future around enforcing it. The aftermath unfolded more slowly than the war itself, because undoing fear took longer than creating it, and as human fleets withdrew along deliberate timelines, leaving behind transparent monitoring systems rather than occupying forces, the galaxy found itself in an unfamiliar quiet where no single power rushed to fill the vacuum, partly because no one was sure what filling it would invite, and partly because humanity had made it clear through action rather than proclamation that influence did not require presence, only credibility, a concept that unsettled regimes built on spectacle, while inside former Dominion Space Provisional Councils formed under council oversight, advised by human and non-human observers whose authority rested not on weapons but on the undeniable fact that human systems still watched everything, not intrusively but thoroughly, like a ledger waiting to be balanced if necessary. And Kethric's Val was escorted not to a cell or a scaffold but to a tribunal, chamber designed for testimony rather than punishment, where survivors from occupied worlds spoke in measured tones about decisions made far above their lives, and Kethric's listened, stripped of rank and title, discovering that accountability was heavier than execution because it required understanding the cost of one's own certainty, and across those same worlds Virex citizens encountered humans directly for the first time, not as enemies but as auditors, engineers, and medics, surprised to find no gloating, no cultural triumphalism, only an almost frustrating normalcy, humans asking questions, taking notes, fixing systems, and moving on as if saving lives were a maintenance task rather than a moral performance, and this mundane competence did more to dismantle old propaganda than any speech ever could, because it revealed that humanity's power did not come from hatred of the other but from investment in outcomes, while on Earth the long-delayed reckoning began as well, veterans returning to a public still arguing about whether war had been necessary, families watching footage of quiet rescues rather than heroic battles, and politicians attempting to frame the conflict in ways that favor their factions, only to find that the public memory had already settled on something simpler, that promises had been kept and that mattered, and in the Talarin reached the rebuilt capital hosted a summit unlike any before it, not a council of the powerful, but a gathering of the protected, smaller species speaking openly for the first time without intermediaries, their testimonies reshaping trade routes, defense pacts, and early warning systems into networks that favored transparency over dominance, with humans deliberately refusing permanent leadership roles, insisting instead on redundancy and shared oversight, an insistence that frustrated allies accustomed to hierarchy but ultimately forced resilience into the system, and older empires watched these developments with a mix of relief and dread, realizing that the age of plausible deniability was ending, because attacking a weakened neighbor now carried a non-zero chance of drawing human attention, not because humanity wanted to police the galaxy, but because they had demonstrated that they would not unsee what they had already chosen to see, and Admiral Reed, preparing to retire after decades of planning for wars that might never come, stood on the observation deck of a decommissioned command ship and watched it dismantle piece by piece, satisfied not because humanity had won, but because it had not become what it fought, a quiet victory measured not in territory but in restraint, and somewhere on the Talarin homeworld, a child who had once been pulled from rubble looked up at a sky no longer filled with enemy ships and asked a simple question that echoed across cultures, whether friends always came back when you called, a question humanity could never guarantee to answer, but one it would never stop trying to live up to, because the war the Virex Dominion could not survive had rewritten a truth the galaxy could no longer ignore, that attacking a human ally was not just a tactical mistake, it was a moral one, and morality, once enforced with capability, proved far harder to escape than fear. Years later, the consequences continued to unfold in ways no strategist had fully predicted, because the war had not ended history but bent its direction, and the first real sign of that shift came not from a fleet movement or a treaty but from an economic anomaly, as former Dominion systems began outperforming long-established cores once freed from predatory extraction. Their infrastructure rebuilt with human assistance designed for sustainability rather than maximum yield, a quiet rebuke to centuries of imperial logic, and scholars across the galaxy argued over whether this was a true weapon humanity had deployed, the ability to make conquest look obsolete. While on Earth the war faded into textbooks even as its doctrines embedded themselves deeper into planning culture, new generations of officers studying the campaign less for its tactics than for its discipline, the refusal to escalate emotionally, the emphasis on ending capacity rather than seeking spectacle, lessons hard to teach and harder to maintain. And among the Talarin, the memory of the war took on ritual significance, not as a tale of salvation but of reciprocity, annual ceremonies honoring not just the fallen but the promise that had brought humans across the stars, a promise retold so often it became cultural bedrock, shaping how the Talarin approached their own alliances with humility and care, while Kethric's vowed age in quiet confinement, his testimony used in academies as a case study in systemic failure, not vilified but dissected, his greatest regret not defeat but the realization that he had believed power excused obligation, a belief humanity had dismantled without ever articulating it directly, and in distant sectors ambitious powers tested the new order cautiously, probing borders, escalating minor conflicts, watching closely for human response. And when none came because no ally had been attacked and no promise invoked, confusion followed, then understanding that humanity was not omnipresent and did not intend to be, but when a call came from a small trading collective harassed by pirates operating under a proxy banner, the response was swift and precise, the pirates neutralized, the proxy exposed, and the larger power quietly withdrawing before consequences escalated, reinforcing the pattern without grandstanding. And within human space debates continued endlessly, as they always had, about the cost of intervention, the risk of moral overreach, the danger of becoming arbiters rather than partners, debates that sometimes grew heated but never stole preparedness, because the war had burned one lesson into institutional memory, that hesitation in defense of allies carried a price humanity refused to pay again, and Admiral Reed's name eventually joined others on memorial walls not for victories but for stewardship, a recognition that leadership sometimes meant knowing when to stop, and as the galaxy adjusted to this new equilibrium, one defined less by who could conquer and more by who could be trusted. Historians began referring to the conflict not as a Talarin war or the Dominion collapse, but as a line war. The moment a boundary had been drawn not in space but in expectation, a line humanity had crossed once and only once to show it existed, and would not need to cross again unless forced, because the lesson had been delivered quietly, thoroughly, and with no room for misunderstanding. The final years of transition revealed the subtlest change of all, one no sense of array or intelligence model had anticipated, the internal shift within humanity itself, because having demonstrated that it can enforce its values beyond its borders, it now had to live with that knowledge without becoming dependent on it, and this proved harder than any campaign, as new officers, diplomats, and engineers entered service carrying the quiet weight of expectation that humanity would act again if needed, an expectation senior leaders worked deliberately to temper, embedding safeguard into doctrine that required collective verification of obligation before action, not to slow response but to ensure it remained anchored to principle rather than momentum, while across former Dominion space generational attitudes began to diverge, older citizens clinging to fear and resentment, younger ones growing up in systems where human observers were a fact of life but not a threat, where trade flowed more freely and borders mattered less than stability, and these younger voices slowly reshaped politics from within, producing leaders who spoke of cooperation not as surrender but as efficiency, a language learned indirectly from watching how humans operated without demanding applause. And on the Talarin homeworld, the rebuilt cities matured into symbols not of survival but of continuity, their architecture blending old forms with new resilience, plazas designed to host both celebration and evacuation drills because memory had taught them that safety was not paranoia but preparation, and when Talarin representatives took seats in broader councils they spoke with confidence that surprised larger powers, no longer pleading for protection but advocating systems that made protection mutual, citing humanity not as a patron but as proof that ethics scale when backed by planning. And Ketheric's vow passed quietly in confinement, his final recorded statement not a confession or apology, but an observation that the most dangerous mistake an empire could make was believing that restraint in others signaled weakness rather than choice, a sentence that circulated widely in military academies long after his death. While on Earth, the last classified files from the war were gradually declassified, revealing to the public just how close several escalation thresholds had come without ever being crossed, revelations that sparked outrage, relief, and renewed debate in equal measure, but ultimately reinforced trust in institutions that had chosen restraint even when victory made access possible, and as decades passed, a memory of the conflict softened into something almost abstract, referenced in policy arguments and cultural works, but rarely felt viscerally, until a distant frontier incident reminded the galaxy why the lesson endured. A minor power seizing a habitat belonging to a protected collective and issuing demands, confident that time and distance would prevent. Response: only for human envoys to arrive within days, not with fleets but with evidence, arbitration frameworks, and a single reminder of precedent, a reminder sufficient to end the crisis without a shot fired, proving that the true legacy of the war was not the damage inflicted but the deterrence achieved, and that humanity's most enduring weapon had become its reputation for doing exactly what it said it would do. No more, no less, a reputation that kept the peace more effectively than any armada ever could. Decades after the initial conflict, the galaxy had largely adjusted to the new reality that attacking a human ally was not just a tactical error but a moral miscalculation with consequences that reverberated for generations, and the Virex Dominion had been reduced to a cautionary tale studied in academies across countless star systems, their former territories governed by mixed councils, human advisory teams, and local authorities empowered to maintain order without coercion, a delicate balance designed to prevent repetition of past mistakes. While humanity itself had undergone subtle transformations, its military, diplomatic corps, and scientific institutions now carrying the dual legacy of restraint and overwhelming capability, instilling a culture where every action was weighed against principle rather than expediency, ensuring that the moral clarity demonstrated during the Talarin War remained operational rather than symbolic, and on the Talarin homeworld, monuments stood not only to those lost but to the promises kept, reminding citizens and visitors alike that loyalty had tangible consequences and that humanity's intervention had been rooted not in conquest but in obligation. As children played beneath structures that once smoldered, learning from elder stories of human soldiers who arrived quietly, removed threats without spectacle, and left as soon as their duty was complete, their presence defined not by fear but by dependability, and across the galaxy other species began recalibrating their own policies and alliances in response, realizing that the old rules of power were no longer sufficient, that trustworthiness and moral consistency had become strategic tools, and when minor skirmishes or provocations arose on remote worlds, human envoys and task groups arrived not with fleets ready to annihilate, but with evidence, arbitration, and the quiet implication that prior precedent dictated the outcome, a method so effective that potential aggressors thought twice, teaching them that intervention did not require show of force but only commitment to principle backed by capability. And as human fleets continued to operate under these doctrines, rotating through patrols, humanitarian missions, and training exercises, they shaped a galaxy-wide expectation that humanity would respond when commitments were violated, but always in measured proportion, leaving no room for misinterpretation or escalation beyond necessity. And for Ketheric's vows, descendants and surviving Virex leaders, the memory of the war endured not as hatred but as a cautionary framework, a lesson in humility, planning, and the consequences of underestimating a civilization that measured worth not by conquest but by the obligations it chose to honor. And finally, as the sun rose over a rebuilt Talarin city, Admiral Reed, now elderly and retired, observed the horizon alongside Ambassador Rahman and several Talarin leaders, reflecting silently on the years of reconstruction, the recalibration of galactic norms, and the enduring truth that humanity had not sought revenge, domination, or glory only to ensure that those who were promised protection would receive it. And in that quiet moment, above the hum of active rebuilding drones and the laughter of children whose parent had once feared death, the galaxy understood a lesson written not in fire and destruction but in steadfast commitment and restraint, the war that the Virex Dominion could not survive, having reshaped civilization itself, leaving humanity's legacy not in conquered worlds but in the unshakable knowledge that it kept its word, and that knowledge alone had changed the course of history.